One of the key concepts that's going to come out of this crisis that we're in is improving the resiliency of the economy, improving the resiliency of people's lives, the ability to bounce back. Now, in economic terms, resiliency is extremely poorly defined. Economists like to reduce everything to a lot of math. I'm not talking about math here, not because I'm mathophobic, far from it, but because I want to highlight aspects of the economy and how we relate to each other that are not well described in math. And resiliency is certainly one of those that is the most difficult. So, where to start talking about what resiliency is? I thought I would start with something a little different. This is a $1 note from the Cayman Islands. I don't think they use this anymore. But the Cayman Islands are an interesting place. It exists for exactly one reason. There's a little hotspot volcano right in the middle of the Caribbean. Actually, it exists for one other reason internationally, and that is it's the place where a lot of money is laundered, made to disappear, to pop up somewhere else. The Cayman Islands has a very interesting economy. It is kind of the symbol of what is wrong with globalism in many ways, because large companies or individuals can hide money in little tiny islands like the Caymans and have it, well, wherever they need it to be. Avoid taxes, avoid all kinds of responsibilities. The Caymans are the symbol for everything that is wrong in globalism. But if you look at it a different way, we might take some different lessons. You see, one of the problems with resiliency is that the first thing almost everybody thinks about is encouraging savings. If there was a lot more in the way of savings, everybody had their own account, then you would be able to have some ability to self insure, get through a month or two of lockdown or whatever you might have. That's really great. Now, one of the things we have learned in this crisis is that individuals, small businesses, everything didn't have that 1 month in savings. That's quite astonishing. There was no resiliency in the systems, there was no excess capacity. Why? Well, the international system, which includes things like the Caymans, has put a price on money. Basically, money has to keep flowing at all times. Everything has to be more and more dynamic in this global world. The old fashioned concept of putting away money for the winter, putting away goods for the winter to be able to survive it, like, say, Pa Ingalls, is just not the way it works in a highly dynamic world. But it needs to. Savings needs to be encouraged. And if there's one thing we can learn from this process that money gets squirreled away in the Caymans, is that there is indeed a lot of excess capital, idle capital in the system. It's just all what concentrated at one level. Idle capital is not necessarily a threat to the system. It can be a great benefit if it is distributed properly. Now, one of the things that we're going to see, this is early May 2020, uh, because of this crisis, is that we're going to see a tremendous number of bankruptcies. A lot of small businesses are going to close, people are going to go bankrupt, and there are also going to be insurance claims that simply cannot be met. Insurance companies are going to be breaking like crazy. We know that that's going to happen. So, how do we avoid that whole system? Well, at some point, insurance, if you think about it, for a really big emergency has to come from the top. In fact, this is one of the great features of potentially having a large nation is you have a large pool to be able to insure, and you have the mechanisms where you can put money into the system very rapidly. So there is a benefit to a large nation. Okay. But it is primarily one of insurance. It is primarily one of encouraging resiliency. One of the other lessons that we might get from the Caymans comes from the fact that it is indeed an island in the Caribbean. Now, I grew up in Miami, and because of that, my parents, I had already moved away, survived Hurricane Andrew. Hurricane Andrew was devastating. The winds were well over 300 kilometers an hour on the ground, close to 200 miles an hour was the highest track. It destroyed nearly everything. And in the process, big sections of South Florida had to be rebuilt. And they looked at what the shock was, not just to people, but to the economy itself. And a lot of business leaders said, we need to improve the resilience, the ability to bounce back after a hurricane. I mean, after all, we're in the Caribbean. Hurricanes happen. Now, my mom, for example, had a lot of food on hand, was able to survive a few weeks. They filled the bathtub with water, all the things you're supposed to do in a hurricane. That wasn't quite enough for the bigger economy. After Hurricane Andrew, they developed a system with a chief resiliency officer in Dade County and in another one in Florida that was looking at this problem. And they found that it's really not something you can quantify. It's really one of those mushy things that just doesn't work. But the most important thing that they came to understand is that it's all about personal connection, the connection between small businesses or people and the financial institutions. One of the things that has gone wrong in the United States is that there was a fund for businesses to meet the payroll that came in from the federal government, but it was administered by very large banks that didn't have an existing relationship. We just presumed that the market was going to find a way to take care of everything. If there is a very tight relationship between banks and small businesses, and there often very much is in a community, then there is the ability to come in and get a temporary loan for a storm that goes through, something like that. This is the advantage of having an equity-based system or an equity-based world versus a debt-based world. We have encouraged market-based systems that operate at arm's length, that are not based on relationships. They can be quantified, they can be, dollars can be assigned to them. The mushy things like relationships don't seem to be taken into account, but they are extremely important. See, resiliency starts at the local level. It's all about individuals. Now, there are many ways of encouraging savings. I've outlined the need for a safe store of value that maintains its value so that everybody can have savings. Policies that encourage it, for example, in Canada, they have a tax-free savings account that is allowed up to 6,000 Canadian dollars per year, where you can put aside money and it's taken off of your taxes. It's not a big number, but if we have the ability to move money into an account that is taken away from your taxes, then you turn income tax into a consumption tax. It's going to have to be even more progressive to make that such a system work, but it's possible to encourage savings at the local level. And that would encourage resiliency if everybody has that. Yes, there are problems with that sort of thing, but we have IRAs, we have health savings accounts, we have all of these things set aside for specific reasons. What if we simply allow a broader base savings plan so that if you're one of these flexible workers that goes from one job to the next and might have a little bit of unemployment in between, you have a way of having that go up and down and not have to pay taxes here and then have less in your savings account. It's just something to think about. Spreading money out over the longer term. Savings moves money from today into the future. It's the opposite of debt, which moves money from the future into today. And perhaps that's something we need to do. But back to the basic principle of having a more resilient economy, having a more resilient life. It may seem, well, from the example of the Caymans, that that's something that's only available to a few very rich people, to have that kind of money that you can shovel around all around the world and avoid taxes. But let's look at systems that allow everybody to do that to some extent. And of course, clamp down on places like this. Resiliency is absolutely critical. It's not something that we often talk about. It's not something that we can measure very effectively, but we know it needs to happen. If there is a good relationship, an equity based relationship, especially between a financial world and a small business, then there is a direct incentive for that to keep that business operating because they have an equity stake. The insurance from the top can go through the financial institutions, through, say, the Federal Reserve. As the Federal Reserve pumps liquidity into the markets, it can reach the level that it needs to in order to benefit local economies, people, one on one, small businesses, things like that. We don't have a system that is that well connected at this point. We don't have the close relationships. And that is largely by design. Now, there are many other aspects of resiliency which are going to come up. Supply chain management tells us that shorter supply chains are less brittle. And we're going to see reshoring of businesses to the United States as a result of this whole crisis. Basically, as things break all around the world, starting with, say, China, the ability to get parts from China became suddenly very difficult. What if those were more local? It solved some of the problem, but again, this gets into things like the overhead per employee, which has made it more difficult to hire American workers. There are many things that we need to think about all the way through. But resiliency is very poorly defined. It does indeed start with savings. Economists have always been loath to encourage too much in the way of savings because it seems like idle money. We know that there is a tremendous amount of idle money in the system. A lot of it goes through the Caymans, and it sort of disappears. The actual volume and a macroeconomic basis of idle capital is not the issue. What is important is making sure that people can get through this problem or any other problem. What we've had is the biggest shock that we're likely to see in our lifetimes. And we've done a pretty horrible job of surviving it because we don't have resiliency. We don't have the connections on a personal level, or let's just say an equity basis, that really tie us together. And the system was able to fall apart. Resiliency comes from excess capacity and good relationships, ties together. It is something that starts at the bottom. You want to talk about, say, a stable money supply or a Keynesian stimulus. If everybody has some capacity, we don't need a stimulus from the top. Yeah, you have a bad month here or there. Everybody's having a bad month, but there's some savings to draw on. Where does your Keynesian stimulus come from? Bottom up. It's important to have both to have a stable economy. Resiliency, as difficult as it is a concept, is not an option. The more we are interconnected, the more resilient we need to be. But the more interconnected we've become, the less resilient we've been. Because what? Money just flows all around the world and disappears in strange little Caribbean islands. That has to change. It's not about the actual volume of idle capital. There is a lot of it these days. It's a matter of where it is and how it can be used to reach people who need it to get by. If they have the scratch to get by, shocks like this will be less. And if this is just too much for us to save our way through, this is not something you can just fill the hurricane cupboard and have the food ready for the crisis. Injecting money from the top needs to be able to reach people at the bottom very, very quickly. That's what we failed to do in the United States and have made this crisis worse. We will see the effects of this for months and probably years to come as a result. Resiliency is just not an option. Understanding it, discussing it, is critical. What exactly does it mean? It starts with savings, it starts with being properly insured, but it builds out from there. In human terms, it's all about relationships. In economic mathematical terms, well, we don't really have any way of describing it, do we? So let's start with what we have. Let's start with what we know. And let's talk about resiliency.